Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you. I have had a long-term commitment to go to the International Congress of Ethnobiology in Bhutan, and so I can't be with you in Ottawa. But I'm here to sort of represent some of the issues around Theme 5, Space, Place, and Social Justice. And I'm going to give you a really sort of shortened version of a slightly longer paper that I gave at the Annual Association of American Geographers this year. I'll try not to make it too academic, but obviously being an academic, that's not going to be that straightforward. So I've called this short talk, Putting Ourselves on the Map, Exploring Underrepresented Groups' Use of the Geoweb as a Deliberative Tool to Transform Space and Place. This really sort of like, in essence, a lot about the sort of, the general direction of Theme 5 and Theme 5's work. My name's John Corbett. I'm an associate professor at the University of British Columbia on the Okanagan campus. And, for all the partners who are present at the AGM, please, my contact details are at the end. I'd be really interested in getting in touch with you if you're interested in following up anything that I've talked about today. Okay, so what I want to do in this very short talk is to really sort of try to get to grips with these three different things. I first want to talk very briefly about participatory mapping. It's sort of like the essence of my work over the last now 20 years. I want to then draw on an empirical piece of research that we have been undertaking at UBC, which is the development of an online participatory mapping tool. And we've called it GeoLive. And then I actually want to use GeoLive and sort of examine it under the microscope of Horst Rittel and Melvin Weber's conceptualization of wicked problems. There were a couple of planners that talked about problems that were essentially unsolvable, that they called wicked problems. And I want to posit that this paper by Rittel and Weber, it doesn't present us a challenge, something that we need to overcome. In other words, the GeoWeb is a tool which can overcome wicked problems. But really, I want to suggest that in fact this paper helps us to actually better contextualize and understand the limitations of the GeoWeb to actually solve these sort of complex, ill-defined wicked problems that exist. And it also helps us to strategize and move towards actually improving our own practice, as well as to identify and report in a sort of an honest and in a realistic way about the real impacts of our work. So first of all, I'll start talking very briefly about participatory mapping. When I sort of got involved in geography as a discipline, and it's now sort of morphed into these sort of other sort of slightly more sort of fine resolution type studies around geographic information studies, this concept of public participation has really been core. How do we get the public involved in decision making? And mapping really is the sort of praxis of how I approach that. The work that I do, I've called participatory mapping, but often it can be referred to as collaborative mapping, counter mapping, and there's other flavors, for example, public participation, GIS. But central to all of these different terms is the fact that local communities get to make their own maps. And often the information that's represented on these maps are very different from the types of information that you see represented on more mainstream maps. Within almost all the work I do, there's a very, very strong movement towards a social change agenda. And so you can imagine from the perspective of Theme 5, it fits very nicely into the space, place, and social justice type piece. Participatory mapping, it embraces a range of different tools, varying levels of technological complexity. It can be as simple as drawing in the sand through to as I worked last year on my sabbatical with this Aita group, an indigenous group in Luzon in the Philippines, who used global positioning systems to map out the extent of their communities' traditional territories. And then they took this information directly to the government, and then they secured what's called an ancestral domain. In other words, they had exclusive rights over their territory because of the maps that they've produced. But as the mapping technology changes more broadly, we also, I think, within the sort of practice of participatory mapping, need to be able to keep up with this. And so right now for us, one of the major challenges is to sort of take the principles of participatory mapping, in other words, communities making maps for themselves, into an internet type environment, and looking at how we can actually sort of leverage new social media and mobile technologies to work with marginalised communities to allow them to actually share their geosocial data in order, once again, to bring about positive social change. So we've developed this very sort of extendable and expandable tool called GeoLive. It's basically a web-based participatory mapping application. It allows communities to be able to crowdsource their own geosocial information and then decide who and how they want to make this available to a broader public, or maybe just to a select user group, or just to themselves. We've tried to make it as robust and easy to use as possible, and we've worked on a number of different projects, whether it's working with people with physical disabilities on our own campus, using the tool to map out points of exclusion, whether it's working with advocacy organisations like the British Columbia Marine Trails Initiative, trying to encourage people to kayak on the West Coast, whether it's working with people with intellectual disabilities about mapping out their experiences in the employment sector, with First Nations communities to map out place names, or a recent project allowing people affected by the new pipeline that's suggested to be built across the northern part of British Columbia as a way essentially of enabling people to be able to share their own experience related to that. But you can see that pretty well key to the types of work that we're doing is we're working with communities of people whose voices are often underrepresented. We intend to use this tool really specifically to sort of address and redress these social types issues which are implicit within this underrepresentation. So kind of interestingly, the whole sort of practice of participatory mapping really is embedded, within this work around wicked problems. We're often dealing with very complicated social problems, and hoping that mapping will be a solution to them. So I want to return to my sort of original argument in that I posit that Rattel and Weber's paper does not represent researchers with a challenge to overcome, but rather it helps us to understand that often the Geoweb is the wrong tool to actually address these complex social problems. Because, and I'll draw on Rattel and Weber's, a quote from Rattel and Weber's paper here, the search for scientific basis for confronting problems of social policy is bound to fail because of the nature of these problems. They're wicked problems, whereas science has developed to deal with tame problems. And if you change the term science to participatory mapping, I think it kind of sums it up. Wicked problems, basically participatory mapping has been developed primarily to deal with tame problems. It's not really that an effective way in order to be able to deal with complex, wicked problems. And I think that Rattel and Weber's paper, ultimately, it helps us as academics, but also as practitioners, to understand the limitations of our work, our practice, our research, as well as our analysis and our reporting. So what I want to do is I want to use, again, Rattel and Weber's theory to help to sort of frame some of the limitations that we've had working with GeoLive. Now, I understand that there's many different flavors of participatory GeoWeb out there, and GeoLive does not necessarily encompass all of these iterations, but it does provide us, I think, with a relevant and a tested example of a web-based participatory mapping application. So Rattel and Weber end up with like these 10 aspects which they think sort of best outline wicked problems. And what I've done is I've just altered 4 of them, and I've done a little bit of combining in order to think about GeoLive in a slightly more sort of nuanced way. First of all, I want to make the case that wicked problems are really hard to formulate and even talk about with any level of precision. And this is mainly because they're extremely complex. They're really hard to wrap your head around, and also they're heavily interconnected. And so there's a real danger that when we think about, certainly with the work that we do around the development of GeoLive, that we basically will deploy our participatory GeoWeb tools in a sort of singular solution. And that's why I draw on Maslow's law of the instrument here. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you have GeoLive, everything can somehow be addressed using that particular tool. When in fact, maybe this is a really naive way to approach this, because in fact, the use of these tools in certain circumstances might actually agitate and exacerbate a potentially wicked problem. And we have examples from our work, particularly, for example, our work with the pipeline project, where we have a whole series of interconnected issues, but very different perspectives by very different, social groups on those different issues. And there's another thing here, of course, is that when we talk about using the GeoWeb, we can also work with populations that are not bound by space and place. And in doing so, this whole concept of community becomes far more abstracted. We're inviting a wider audience to participate, and this in turn exacerbates the complexity and thus the wickedness, and thus our ability to be able to solve it using participatory mapping of these wicked problems. The second point is that there's no templates to follow. In other words, every wicked problem is unique. Of course, we have experience and we have a history around working with, for example, Indigenous groups, and this helps to guide what we're doing. But at the same time, when we think about developing these types of GeoWeb applications, just because of the whole reality of trying to design a software program, we gravitate towards these sort of cookie cutter type solutions. We're interested in economies of scale, efficiencies, reducing complexity, so that we don't end up having to design a whole new piece of software for every single iteration or every project that we work on. But at the same time, we've also discovered that the more wicked the problems that we work with, the greater the need for those groups around having unique solutions. So every single GeoLive project that we've worked on basically does become unique. And so from our perspective, this makes it pretty well impossible for us to be able to ever, reach a sort of final, version release of GeoLive. But every single iteration of what we do becomes a sort of one-shot deal. Which brings me on to my next point, is that one of the things that Rattel and Weber say, which is really interesting, which is that wicked problems really, we should aim to improve them rather than try to solve them. But I think for us, this means that when we begin a GeoWeb project, we need to be a lot more aware of our ability to be able to actually finish it, because there often is no idealized state to actually work towards. What, for example, with our project, would a finished project even look like? We've worked now on about 20, 25 different projects, and I would say that the ones which continue and sort of take on form, they never stop, because they're dealing with problems which also never stop. And in fact, this whole thing around sort of GeoLive and what it means, it becomes like a snowball. We're constantly absorbing more and more new projects while at the same time never shedding them. And this really impacts our ability around the tool development, but I think also more broadly around participatory mapping to be able to reach final solutions. And so this also makes me think a little bit about, well, how do we even understand kind of what a successful outcome might actually look like in regards to the impacts of our work? This is a really hard thing to do. Now, we use tools, for example, like Google Analytics. They help us provide us with some sort of numeric example of how tools are actually being used, but our true understanding of the impacts of our work is really limited. And so I'd like to put this out to the group as part of this AGM, that I think one of the things that we should really be working towards is actually trying to understand better what some sort of idealized outcome related to our work might look like, and how we would develop the methods to be able to understand that, because I think this remains a really important area of study. And the final thing, this is really, again from Rattel and Weber's work that I think is really important, is that if we do set out to actually address and work on these problems, we have to take a high level of responsibility for them. And this is, I suppose, an issue which is specifically important for academics, because we need to take responsibility for our actions. We might, begin a whole chain of events or series of events which we were unaware of, at the outcome or the outset of actually trying to do our work. And of course, this in turn can actually exacerbate the wickedness of the problems that we're actually dealing with. We need to have a clearly articulated set of ethics and principles that we work towards. We need to be honest and clear with the communities with whom we work. And we need to be aware that problems are often persistent, whereas technologies and the participatory GeoWeb, it's largely ephemeral. Thanks very much, guys. I hope I haven't banged on for too long. Again, my name's John Corbett. Here's my email address. I would love to get in contact, particularly with any partners, if you're interested in following up on anything that I've said. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.